This is City Focus, the podcast from the League of Oregon Cities, where we explore the issues that matter to cities across Oregon.
Welcome to episode 9 of City Focus. On this episode, I'm once again joined by LOC Lobbyist Erin Doyle for a conversation about third-party building inspection preservation. Erin and I sit down and discuss this fundamental issue and how the League will clarify the ability of local governments to have private party building officials and inspectors provide these services, as well as they'll work to assure that decisions on these provisions are at the discretion of local officials. Erin, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It is good to have you. We're talking about, I think this was priority number 6, third-party building inspections. Actually, this one kind of surprised me when it made the list. I've been aware of it from before. I didn't realize it was such a high priority. Can you give us a little background on what is this priority all about?
So this priority in the big picture is about how cities choose to meet the needs of their communities through how they hire and staff programs. And so I think this raised or came up to the top. There are a lot of communities that are directly impacted who use third-party building officials to run their programs. But there's a lot of cities who understand that sometimes a third-party provider is the best use of their resources. So cities will hire outside legal counsel or have a planning service that is run through the private sector, and they just hire them on an ad-needed basis. And so I think this kind of rose to the top because this really feels like the state telling us how we run our cities on a fundamental level. Yeah. And that's very uncomfortable for us. So over time, we've been working with third-party building inspectors who were trying to be allowed to do a specific type of inspection, even though they worked for the private sector. Okay. There was a law in place that basically said one license type is only valid if you're a government employee. Little weird, but it was a compromise in a legislative conversation that I don't think we were really part of at that time, and those folks who work in the third-party world, those private contractors, were trying to say, you've tested the program. There's no big major flaws in this type of inspection being done with this type of licensure. Let us have that license too. It doesn't make sense if I work for a city one day and then I go into a private company the next that I suddenly am less competent at that type of inspection. So we were supporting that. And during that legislative conversation, the issue was raised as to whether or not third-party building officials, which are different than inspectors, could continue to run local government inspection programs, that it might be unconstitutional. Okay, so that I saw that, and that kind of made me just, you do the So can you explain why they thought it was unconstitutional? Maybe just, a ballpark, a best guess? So what they have stated, and by they, I mean the state's analysis that they've been able to provide so far, and it's not a formal opinion of the Department of Justice, but they're working on that right now, it stated that because a building official has discretion over decisions over whether or not something meets the law or not, that they needed to be a government employee. Otherwise, you were privatizing a governmental function, essentially, which violates the Constitution. And that's really about not the case law around that has really focused on letting one part of a private industry regulate another part of the private industry. There's an inherent conflict of interest. And also that you pay government to do government work and you pay the private sector to do private sector work. And so we've pushed back on that because we think that the key to all of that is whether or not there's governmental oversight of the program. And there are two ways in which the government provides plenty of oversight over third-party building officials. The first is cities that contract with these third-party providers oversee those contracts. Yeah. They have the ability to hire and fire, end that contract if someone's not abiding by the laws, the rules, or actually just acting in bad faith, or anything that basically would make it a bad proposition for the local government to continue using a third-party provider. The other piece is in the state's hands, and that is through their certifications and licensing programs. And so if there's a person who's holding themselves out as a building official who has a certification from the state who is failing to abide by the building code or consistently misinterpreting the building code, which is really the job of the building official, that they can revoke their licensure, or there's other ways of reining that back in.
Sure.
They have oversight capability. So it's our position that those third-party building officials have sufficient governmental oversight that we aren't violating the Constitution. So that's a conversation we're now having more directly with the DOJ, and that we have been working really hard with the state to kind of get a better solidification of that, because I think that the long-term ramifications of an opinion like that make it really difficult for local jurisdictions to do basic functions hiring an attorney. A city attorney has pretty good discretion.
Well, and in other cities, I know in putting together, a lot of smaller cities don't have one. They do. They contract out to a private sector. You'll see one person who's a city attorney for a number of different cities. How, with third-party building inspections, we're talking we've got a housing and homelessness crisis going on in the state right now. How does this issue impact that issue?
So when we were talking about that housing and homelessness priority, we were talking about one of those issues that's feeding into the crisis is that there's a lack of people to do the trade work.
Yeah.
We even have a bigger shortage of inspectors and building officials in this state. So everything you do to prevent locally placed people or people who have a regularly scheduled time to be in a city to do these inspections or to serve as the building official slows that process down even further. When I was out this summer talking to some of our local communities out in the Columbia Gorge in Eastern Oregon who had lost their local service provider and were in the process, they had to switch back to the state's service. Yeah. It took 10 weeks to get a building permit filed. 10 weeks is the construction cycle.
Yes.
And then that's not a stick in the ground. That's not a nail in the wall. So it's really going to impact not just housing, but economic development. Businesses have to get built. You can't do it without inspectors and provide for any sort of human safety or.
Sure. I'm seeing this again impacting smaller cities again, more outlying cities who don't necessarily, there may be a pool of government inspectors in the more metro areas, but if you're out in the rural areas, like you said, 10 weeks is the building cycle. To me, that just exacerbates the problem that we're having in those areas with lack of affordable housing. So you couldn't even get to the point where you're having to look for qualified people to build it if you're stuck right there at that point.
Yeah, and I think third-party inspection programs have been really helpful for smaller communities, especially ones that exist in larger counties. So the way the system is structured is basically the state provides the service unless the county decides it wants to provide the service. Then the county provides the service countywide. But then a city can choose to take on the inspection services at the city level. And so basically, if you're in a county that's rather large geographically, getting consistent levels of service can be more difficult if you're farther away from the main centers of population. Sure. And so a lot of this impacted our smaller cities that are on the edges of bigger metro areas or actually, hundreds of miles from those areas, but are having difficulty getting consistent services just because the lack of resources at the county level as well. So cities were using these third-party building inspection services because they could contract for them to be in the office once a week to do all inspections, whatever time rate. So they were getting much faster turnaround. It was a much more efficient and effective service. And so it's been a boon to those areas because they're getting projects built. And for a small community, you seeing 10 houses go up, that's a big deal. That's something we really need in order to address the housing shortages in a community of 100 people. 10 new units, that's huge.
That's huge. That's 10 families that have a place to live. So these third parties are typically private sector individuals that have gone through all the licensure, the education. So I would imagine there is a sort of an impetus on their part to, number one, still be able to perform this work, because if they're kind of pushed out of the game, that's not good for their livelihood. So is there a partnership with this group of individuals throughout the state to partner together with them to kind of push this forward?
We have definitely been partnering with the third-party building inspectors who provide
so
a lot of
services. Like a guild or something?
They have hired their own lobbyist.
Okay.
I can work with other lobbyists. It's fine.
Good.
So, but, kind of talking about what their job and roles and responsibilities have had. There's a couple of bigger companies that provide these services to a number of our cities. And so we've been working with them, but we've also been working with the counties because there's a direct impact to counties as well. If we lose our local programs and they get subsumed by the county, the county has to have the resources to take care of it. And if they don't, they have to give up their entire program and revert it back to the state, which is, you want to talk about inefficiencies, trying to get people at a regional level. Yeah. It's a large area you have to cover. Yeah. And we have some pretty big counties in the state.
Yeah, oh, yes, we do. We do. So, looking at it on its surface, you think third-party building inspection, oh, how big can that be? But it sounds like it's actually quite a big issue that does dovetail with a number of other issues. So it's important. It sounds like the people, the stakeholders in this are all motivated to make sure that this does not change. So as far as from a city perspective, if it does change, you've kind of talked a little bit about that, what that looks like. So from the perspective of member cities, especially the ones that it's going to have more of an impact on, how can they help you to advocate more effectively for them?
So as this issue came up in 2018 originally, the reason why we were successful in kind of stopping legislative momentum that was going to basically rip these programs out of local governments, it was the local government stories that won this conversation and gave us more time from the legislature. And they've been extremely effective in talking to the governor's office to kind of talk about the economic development and housing impacts it's going to have. And so for cities who are directly impacted, continuing that conversation with their legislators, talking about why this is an important resource and tool, that's crucial to our success. And they've been really great about that. And getting that pressure on the development community and the contractors in their area to think about things in the long term, I think is going to be the most important piece of this. I know that we're working on a relationship with the state right now to see that they're going to walk with us as opposed to against us on this issue, which is the other place where I think cities can do is talking to the regional solutions folks about the impacts that's going to have. So that message can get filtered up to the governor's office to make some more of that political flexibility come to fruition as we work through the legal issues.
Okay, so then that's interesting because not every city is necessarily going to be impacted by this or affected by it. So how about the cities that are looking at this going, well, that doesn't affect me. Is there a way that maybe it does and maybe they ought to get involved in this?
So there is, because a lot of cities that have internal building inspection programs, like they have an in-house building official and building inspectors, can't meet the ebbs and flows of the building inspection process because construction is cyclical. Yeah. And so sometimes you get a big push to do plan inspections. And so you farm that out to a third party to cover that overflow issue. A lot of these businesses, if they lose the building official and the more complete programs that they do, are wondering how to retain their staff. Just like we don't hire and fire based on the ebbs and flows of the construction industry. They like to have a steady stream of staff as well. So those cities that have internal programs need to be able to protect that capacity to go to the overflow at third parties. So that's the other part of it. But I think there's just a fundamental local authority to choose how we staff. Yeah. And that's the approach that I think cities need to be thinking about this is, do you want the state telling you who you can and cannot contract with at the end of the day? Do you have to have a full-time hearings officer if you want to have a land use system? No, that doesn't make sense. It's the same thing here. It's the same principle of letting cities figure out how to best meet the needs of their communities.
Okay. And that as far as from a league perspective, is what it's all about. So
it's the foundation of why we're here.
It truly is. It truly is. So I'm going to check back in with you as the session goes on to make sure. I've got some other guests lined up coming in that are coming from a smaller city that are dealing with this right now, that have a story to tell, which will be coming up here in the new year. But I'm going to wrap this up now because I think we've covered everything we can on this. Again, I'm going to link your email in here. I'm assuming, again, you want people to tell you stories, send you anecdotes, what's happening in my city and how they can help. Anything else?
I think if you're working with a county to get your county to provide your services, what's that felt like? Do you always feel like you're getting the best attention? And then if there are other, impacts that you can see that I haven't talked about, I'd love to hear about that because that helps me give a better and more robust conversation to legislators. Okay, so keep those lines of communication open and telling the tales and really use the league. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, Erin Doyle, League of Oregon Cities Lobbyist. I want to thank you again for coming in and taking the time to talk about this really important issue. And I will be checking in with you as the session goes on to see how this is going. Great. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks for listening to this episode of City Focus. Be sure to check out show notes for Erin's email so that you can share through her your experiences with this issue. My name is Denise Nanke, and I'm the host and producer of City Focus, the podcast from the League of Oregon Cities. The League is a governmental entity formed to work with our members to help local government better serve the citizens of Oregon. LOC strives to be the go-to place for Oregon cities as a resource hub for advocacy, education, and best practices. While our focus is Oregon and Oregon issues, we realize that we have many issues in common across the country, and we hope this podcast will reach beyond the borders of our state to share ideas and solutions. If you have suggestions for topics or comments about any of our podcasts, send me an email at cityfocus@orcities.org.